In the aftermath of World War II, the Korean peninsula found itself at the center of a new conflict. Divided by foreign powers, the nation was plunged into a tumultuous period that would shape its destiny. This is the story of the Korean War. At the Tehran and Yalta conferences in 1943 and 1945 respectively, the Soviet Union made promises to join its allies in the Pacific War after victory in Europe. Following Germany's surrender, the USSR declared war on Japan and occupied the northern part of Korea as well as Manchuria. Meanwhile, US colonials Dean Rusk and Charles H. Bonesteel were tasked with dividing Korea into Soviet and US occupation zones, proposing the 38th parallel as the dividing line. On September 8th of 1945, US Lieutenant General John R. Hodge arrived in Incheon to accept the Japanese surrender south of the 38th parallel. He became the military governor, directly controlling South Korea as head of the United States Army military government in Korea. However, the idea of a 5-year trusteeship for Korea was met with resistance, and protests erupted. To contain the unrest, martial law was declared and the USAMGIK banned strikes. Faced with the lack of progress from the Joint Commission, the US government decided to hold an election under United Nations auspices for an independent Korea. However, the Soviet authorities and the Korean communists refused to cooperate on the grounds that it would not be fair, and many South Korean politicians also boycotted it, resulting in it ending in a failure. By 1948, the Soviet Union withdrew its forces from Korea and the US troops followed suit. However, the withdrawal of troops did not bring peace. Insurgency erupted in South Korea in 1949, marked by socialist uprisings and clashes between the socialist guerrillas and government forces. While the insurgencies continued, the strategic calculations of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin were changing. With the victory of communist forces in China, as well as the Soviets' nuclear capabilities, Stalin believed that the time was right for war in Korea. He granted Kim Il-sung permission to attack the south on the condition that Soviet forces sent to support him would not openly engage in combat. At the end of 1949, Kim Il-sung visited Stalin and expressed his desire to poke South Korea with the tip of a knife. While China was still reorganizing after its brutal civil war, Mao Zedong showed no interest in starting a war. However, the Soviet Union, driven by its geopolitical interests in northeastern Asia, was supportive. After a secret visit to Moscow in March of 1950, Kim Il-sung arrived in Beijing on May 13th. Mao Zedong was surprised by the sudden turn of events, but did not actively oppose the military risks, as Stalin had already promised full support. On June 18th, the Korean People's Army received orders to prepare for an attack on South Korea. Soviet generals were sent to North Korea to assist in planning the attack. Due to this support, Kim revised his war plans, shifting from a limited operation to a general attack across the 38th parallel. During this planning, tensions increased along the border with clashes initiated by both sides. Then, on June 7th of 1950, Kim Il-sung called for a Korea-wide election to unify Korea, but this peace overture to the south was rejected. Thus, the North Korean leader accelerated preparations for war while being convinced that a North Korean invasion would be welcomed by much of the South Korean population. On June 25th of 1950, the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel, citing retaliation for provocations, and invaded South Korea. Within just 4 hours, their T-34 tanks and infantry broke through the South Korean defenses and headed straight for Seoul. Backed by tanks, multiple infantry divisions totaling up to 28,000 troops advanced from Pyongyang to Seoul, while another 2 divisions and 1 regiment advanced along the western coast. The South Korean forces were outnumbered and not prepared. To disguise the war's true nature, Kim Il-sung propagated the idea that it was South Korea that had initiated the invasion. He claimed that the Syngman Rhee government, under American control, had suddenly launched a full-scale invasion above the 38th parallel. On the other hand, South Korean forces were caught off guard and suffered significant casualties in early stages of the war. These South Korean troops were poorly equipped, and only about half of the forces along the 30th parallel were in a state of readiness. Key areas were quickly occupied and the defensive line collapsed, leading to a rapid southward retreat. In the US, the Truman administration was caught off guard by the invasion of Korea. Initially, they were more focused on European security and thus did not include Korea in their strategic defense plans. However, they feared that allowing Korea to be overrun would have dire consequences and could lead to a world war. The administration also considered the importance of Japan's security in the region and recognized a non-hostile Korea was necessary for Japan's defense. On June 25th of 1950, The UN Security Council, controlled by the US, unanimously condemned the North Korean invasion and recommended other member states to provide military assistance to South Korea. The Soviet Union, which had boycotted the Security Council meetings due to the US not accepting the newly formed Communist China into it, challenged the legitimacy of the resolution and the scope of the war. They argued that the UN Charter's scope did not cover the conflict, as it was initially seen as a civil war. However, the Security Council, unimpeded by the absence of the Soviet Union and Communist China, proceeded with the resolution. Despite financial and political limitations imposed by Congress, the US government decided to engage in the war considering the potential threat posed by communist expansion. On June 27th, President Truman authorized the deployment of US air and naval forces to assist South Korea. The US also requested an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, notifying member states of the invasion and seeking their support. On July 7th, the UN Security Council passed a resolution on the organization of a unified command under MacArthur, then Commander-in-Chief of the US Far East Forces stationed in Japan. Then, the UN Security Council passed the establishment of the UN Command under the absence of the Soviet Union. In the following months, troops from more than 17 countries would successfully arrive on the Korean peninsula to aid South Korea, with the vast majority being from the US. Meanwhile, while both objecting severely to US presence within the area, neither the USSR nor China wanted to directly confront the US and stated that they would not actively engage the US Army, for now at least. After the UN forces were finally organized near Korea, the North Korean People's Army had already pushed the South Korean forces to the Busan perimeter and the situation seemed dire. In response, General Douglas MacArthur devised a plan to launch an amphibious assault at the port of Incheon, located on the western coast of South Korea. This operation aimed to encircle and cut off the North Korean People's Army's supply lines, allowing the UN forces to regain the initiative, while other UN forces defend the Busan perimeter with the South Koreans. The Incheon landing took place on the 15th of September 1950. UN forces, predominantly consisting of American troops, conducted a daring amphibious assault, overcoming one of the most steepest tides in fortified defenses. The Korean People's Army, caught off guard with their supply lines disrupted, were forced to retreat. At this time, almost all of the main force of the Korean People's Army was assembled on the front line of Busan, completely unable to parry the American amphibious assault on the side, and was defeated almost in an instant. On the 25th of September, Seoul was recaptured by UN forces. Furthermore, US air superiority allowed the US to conduct air raids which caused heavy damage to KPA, destroying most of its tanks and much of its artillery. KPA troops in the south at the Busan perimeter, instead of effectively withdrawing north, rapidly disintegrated, leaving Pyongyang vulnerable. This landing is considered one of the greatest plans and military victories by General MacArthur. Following this landing and the subsequent expellation of the KPA from below the 30th parallel, General MacArthur made the decision to invade North Korea and pursue the retreating KPA. The UN forces, spearheaded by American troops, crossed the 30th parallel and advanced into North Korean territory. The objective was to bring the war closer to its resolution by removing the North Korean regime from power. This decision was made despite Truman reminding MacArthur that operations north of the 30th parallel were authorized if and only if, at the time of such operation, there was no entry into North Korea by major Soviet or Chinese Communist forces, no announcements of intended entry, nor a threat to counter our operations militarily. To which there were, actually. As a matter of fact, on the 30th of September, Zhou Enlai warned the US that China was prepared to intervene in Korea if the US crossed the 30th parallel. This communication, however, was interpreted as a bald attempt to blackmail the UN and was dismissed. Zhou Enlai also attempted to advise KPA commanders on how to conduct a general withdrawal by using the same tactics that allowed Chinese Communist forces to successfully escape Chiang Kai-shek's encirclement campaigns in the 1930s, but the KPA commanders did not use these tactics effectively, especially under constant bombardment by the US Air Force. The 8th US Army drove up to Western Korea and captured Pyongyang on the 19th of October in 1950. Moreover, the 187th Airborne Regiment Combat Team made their first two combat jumps during the Korean War on the 20th of October 1950 at Suncheon and Sukcheon. The mission was to cut the road north going to China, preventing North Korean leaders from escaping from Pyongyang, and to rescue US prisoners of war. China, concerned about the proximity of UN forces to its border, issued warnings against further advancement into North Korea. On October 1st of 1950, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung sent a letter to Chinese leader Mao Zedong, urgently requesting Chinese military intervention to aid the North Korean forces. On the same day, Soviet ambassadors forwarded a telegram from Joseph Stalin to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai requesting that China send 5 to 6 divisions into Korea, while making it clear that Soviet forces themselves would not directly intervene. In a series of emergency meetings that lasted from the 2nd to 5th of October, Chinese leaders debated whether to send Chinese troops into Korea or not. There was considerable resistance among many leaders, including senior military officials, to confronting the US and Korea due to the vast difference in firepower and air superiority. Mao, however, strongly supported intervention, and Zhou Enlai was one of the few Chinese leaders who firmly supported him. After Lin Biao refused Mao's offer to command Chinese forces in Korea, Mao decided that Peng Dehuai would be the commander of the Chinese forces in Korea after Peng agreed to support Mao's position. After Peng made the case that if US troops conquered Korea and reached the Yalujiang, they might cross it and invade China, citing MacArthur's public statements that he wanted to extend the Korean War into China and return Kuomintang to power, the Politburo agreed to intervene in Korea. Hence, on October 5th of 1950, China sent the People's Volunteer Army to the battlefield. To demonstrate his resolution, Mao Zedong even sent his son to the battlefield, whom was later killed by an artillery shell. The first engagements by the PVA with UN forces would be in the Battle of Onjan, Unsan, and Pakchan, in which they probed the strength of UN forces and identified weak points. It is to be noted that while Stalin allowed the Soviet Air Force to provide air cover and transport more aid into China, they did not advance more than 60 kilometers into the front line and thus were mostly useless to the PVA. The PVA were also severely under-equipped in both aspects of clothing, weapons, and air or artillery superiority. In fact, the firepower capability of the UN outranked the PVA by a factor of more than 5 to 1 in the UN's favor. Lastly, the PVA did not employ human wave tactics, since this would be instantly countered by UN firepower, instead using small organized squads of around 50 men to assault strategic positions, typically in the cover of the night, since the darkness gave the PVA some sort of advantage against the firepower of the UN forces. Regardless, after a few initial probing skirmishes, the PVA decided to launch an offensive on the western flank of UN troops, while reinforcing the east in the first phase offensive. Crossing the Yalujiang, thousands of soldiers from the PVA 39th Army encircled and attacked the US 8th Cavalry Regiment with 3-pronged assaults from the north, northwest, and west, and overran the defensive position flanks in the Battle of Unsan. Despite their overwhelming firepower, this surprise assault by the PVA resulted in the West UN defense lines crumbling and the subsequent UN retreat back to the Qingchuan River. However, the PVA abruptly stopped the offensive and disappeared into hideouts following this victory. MacArthur, therefore, was unconvinced that the Chinese had openly intervened because of the sudden PVA withdrawal. This resulted in MacArthur launching the Home by Christmas offensive on November 24th with the intent of ending the Korean War by Christmas, as seen in the name. He instructed the US 8th Army to advance in northwest Korea while the US X Corps attacked along the Korean east coast. The PVA, however, were already prepared and launched their second phase offensive against US forces, which is more properly called a counter-offensive. On November 25th, on the Korean Western Front, the PVA 13th Army Group inflicted heavy losses on the US 2nd Infantry Division of the 8th Army on their right flank at the Battle of Qingchuan River, with numerous individual squads penetrating into the depth of US flanks and utilizing everything they could to cut off their escape routes while the main army assaulted from the front. This was a tactic that the 8th Army did not imagine to be practical, since the PVA's lack of armored vehicles would mean certain death to those who infiltrated the back ranks. Unable to hold up against this assault, the 8th Army began to retreat from North Korea, crossing the 38th parallel mid-December. UN morale hit a rock bottom when Lieutenant General Walton Walker, commander of the US 8th Army, was killed on the 23rd of December 1950 in an automobile accident. On the Eastern Front, on November 27th, the 9th Corps of the PVA penetrated into both flanks of the US offensive line and managed to completely encircle the 31st Regimental Combat Team of the 7th Division of the US Army and the 1st Division of the US Marine Corps of the X Corps at the Battle of Changjin Lake. However, due to bad weather, where temperatures reached less than -40 degrees Celsius, the 20th and 27th Armies of the 9th Corps of the PVA were rendered combat ineffective due to numerous individuals dying of hypothermia. The encircled X Corps capitalized on this and their superiority in technology. Many of the bridges that connected the retreat paths were bombed by infiltrating PVA, but the US physically constructed bridges to replace them and delivered via air. Since the PVA attacked at night, the X Corps could escape during the day while lining up a wall of tanks and constantly firing both artillery and flares during the night in order to fight against PVA assaults. As the 10th Army Relief Force finally joined the fray, the X Corps successfully broke through, but not before losing more than 5,000 people after Task Force Faith was completely annihilated and the regiment flag captured by the Chinese. The retreating X-Corps managed to establish a defensive perimeter at the port city of Hungnam on December 11th, and were able to evacuate by December 24th to reinforce the badly depleted US 8th Army to the south. Before escaping, the UN forces razed most of Hungnam City, with particular attention to the port facilities. More than 15,000 US troops were killed and injured during this battle, culminating in one of the most humiliating defeats of the Korean War. However, it also revealed the PVA's severe lack of military weapons, such as artillery, since they were unable to annihilate the encircled forces at Changjin Lake despite the opportunity. A ceasefire proposal presented by the UN to China shortly after the Battle of Qingchuan River on December of 1950 was rejected by the Chinese government. After the victories of the first and second phase offensives, China's goal went from regaining lost North Korean territory to total victory by expelling the UN forces from Korea. Hence, the PVA and the KPA launched the third phase offensive, also known as the Chinese New Year's Offensive, on New Year's Eve of 1950. The offensive broke through the UN defense line, causing them to retreat across the board on January 2nd of 1951. The Chinese and North Korean troops entered Seoul on January 4th and crossed the Han River on January 5th and occupied Incheon on the 8th. By then, the UN had retreated to the south of the 37th parallel line. However, despite this success, Peng Dehuai believed that the UN army was retreating southward in a planned way in an attempt to lure the enemy deep and repeat the old trick of landing in Incheon, so he ordered the volunteers to stop pursuing and the battle ended on January 8th. On the 1st of February 1951, the UN General Assembly passed the draft of the First Committee with 44 votes in favor, 7 votes against, and 8 abstentions, which became the Resolution 498. This resolution affirmed that the People's Republic of China's intervention in North Korea was an act of aggression and called on the Chinese to cease its confrontation with the UN forces and withdraw from the Korean Peninsula. On February 2, 1951, Zhou Enlai issued a statement accusing the US of manipulating the United Nations and slandering the People's Republic of China since the UN did not have the participation of legal representatives of the People's Republic of China. Hence, he claimed that this resolution was beyond the authority of the Security Council. Shortly thereafter, the two sides once again fell into large-scale exchange of fire at the battlefield without much change in territory. On April 11th, Truman relieved MacArthur from command. MacArthur was relieved primarily due to his determination to expand the war into China, which Congress believed would needlessly escalate the war and consume too much already overstretched resources. He was also relieved for advocating intensely for the use of atomic bombs in the war. Despite MacArthur's claims that he was restricted to fighting a limited war when China was fighting all out, congressional testimony revealed that China was also using restraint as much as the US was, as they were not using air power against frontline troops, communication lines, ports, naval air forces, or staging bases in Japan, which had been crucial to the survival of UN forces in Korea. There was also fear that crossing to China would provoke the Soviet Union into entering the war. General Omar Bradley testified that there were 35 Russian divisions totaling some 500,000 troops in the Far East, and, if set into action, with approximately 85 Russian submarines in the vicinity of Korea, could overwhelm US forces and cut supply lines, as well as potentially assist China in taking over territory in Southeast Asia. The USSR had also developed nuclear weapons by now, and the use of nuclear weapons in Korea by MacArthur would severely jeopardize the safety of Europe, as the main concern for US during this time was European safety against the Soviets. Subsequently, General Matthew Ridgway assumed command of the UN forces. He focused on improving morale and intelligence work, adopted positional warfare at each step, and took advantage of the Air Force's artillery equipment. Unlike the conceited MacArthur, whose ego was severely wounded and was incapable of capitalizing on the enemy's weakness, Ridgway was much more observant and smart. He had initially observed how the PVA forces lacked mechanized components, relying on physical running to chase after their opponents. Deducing that the maximum time the PVA could sustain an offensive was around a week before their logistics were stretched thin, he intended not to seize territory, but to consume the PVA's vital forces. When the PVA attacked, the UN forces would retreat systematically, and while the PVA's offensive stalled, or when the PVA themselves retreated, he would counterattack with a tempo. Ridgway launched Operation Thunderbolt after taking office on January 25th of 1951, and the volunteers were forced to retreat to the north of the Han River. Ridgway exploited the fact that the PVA had not yet fully rested and attacked from west to east. On the 1st of February, the French and American Allied forces defeated the PVA in the Battle of Twin Tunnels. On the evening of February 11th, the PVA launched a counterattack in Hengcheng, beginning the 4th phase offensive, restraining the UN army, and planned to attack the Korean 8th Division in the northwest of Hengcheng, thus opening a gap in attacking the US defense in Wangju. After defeating UN forces, the PVA used Hengcheng to attack the South Korean 3rd, 5th, and 8th Divisions, as well as the first part of the US 2nd Division and the Airborne 187th Regiment, which to a certain extent eased the pressure on the PVA on the entire battlefield. On the 13th of February, the PVA launched an assault on Toppingli, defended by the 23rd Regiment of the US 2nd Infantry Division called the Freeman's Regiment. Using their sheer firepower, the regiment was able to successfully repel all PVA attacks and defend their position. This greatly boosted the morale of the US military. In March, Mao Zedong sent a cable to Stalin requesting air cover and supplies for Chinese forces. Stalin agreed to provide additional support, including Air Force divisions, anti-aircraft divisions, and trucks. However, the logistical problems for the PVA persisted throughout the war. The Chinese soldiers faced shortages of food, ammunition, and transportation, which hindered their effectiveness on the battlefield, and Ridgway utilized this advantage to the fullest. Furthermore, due to the lack of a modern air force, the PVA had no so-called difference between the front line and the logistics on the battlefield. The entire front line was exposed to fierce air raids by the US Air Force. Hence, the PVA could only use night to make surprise attacks and rush to repair roads and bridges, which were blown up again the day after repair. From March 7th to April 4th of 1951, the US military conducted Operation Ripper and Operation Killer, which aimed to inflict as much damage on the PVA as possible. On March 7th, the UN Army concentrated more than 200,000 troops, supported by hundreds of aircraft, and attacked the Chinese and North Korean troops across the board. On the night of March 14th to March 15th, the South Korean 1st Infantry Division and the US 3rd Infantry Division recaptured Seoul, marking the 4th and final time since June of 1950 that the capital had changed hands. After the Chinese Army's domestic reinforcement corps arrived one after another on April 16th, the total strength of the volunteers from the Korean Peninsula battlefield surpassed that of the United Nations for the first time, and they had the upper hand in numbers. In response, the PVA launched a counteroffensive in late April of 1951 called the 5th Phase Offensive, with 3 field armies, approximately 700,000 men. The first thrust of the offensive fell on the 1st Corps of the US Army, which fiercely resisted at the Battle of Imjin River and the Battle of Kapyong, blunting the impetus of the offensive. Casualty ratios were grievously disproportionate. Wu Hua had expected a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio, but instead, Chinese combat casualties from the 22nd to 29th of April totaled between 40,000 and 60,000, compared to only 4,000 for the UN, a casualty ratio between 10-to-1 and 15-to-1. By the time Peng had called off the attack in the western sector on the 29th of April, the 3 participating armies of the PVA had lost a third of their frontline combat strength within a week. This was partly due to the difference in firepower, as seen in how a single UN artillery battalion fired more than 12,000 rounds within 24 hours. At the month's end, the PVA planned the 3rd step of the 5th phase offensive, which was the withdrawal. They estimated that this withdrawal would take around 10 to 15 days to complete for the 340,000 remaining men, and set the retreat date for the night of the 23rd of May. However, they were caught off guard when Ridgway ordered the US 8th Army to counterattack and regain the Kansas line on the morning of the 12th of May, 23 hours before the expected withdrawal in the UN May-June 1951 counteroffensive. During the retreat in face of the UN counteroffensive, the 180th Division of the 60th Army of the 3rd Corps of the PVA was cut off by the enemy in the northwestern area of Zhenjiang, encircled. On May 20th, the US Army and the South Korean National Army quickly blocked the gap opened by an armored spearhead breakout attempt by the 180th Division, given their high degree of mechanization due to Soviet materials. Although around 5,600 people broke through to the north of the 30th parallel, because the 180th Division Party attempted to break out by dispersion, US forces were able to kill a large number of officers and soldiers of the division and capture thousands more, accounting for more than 1/3 of all PVA soldiers captured during the Korean War by UN forces. This is considered one of Ridgway's greatest successes against the PVA during the Korean War. Meanwhile, the UN counteroffensive, which was now pushing to Chirwan and Yeoncheon, met fierce resistance from the 63rd Volunteer Army, which was ordered to slow down the speed of the UN Army's attack no matter the cost. Despite being almost completely annihilated, the 63rd Volunteer Army managed to stop the UN offensive around 40 kilometers into the 30th parallel. This was the second time that the UN Army managed to step beyond the 30th parallel. Ridgway's successes against the PVA 4th and 5th offensives earned him much fame, and the ending casualties of the offensives, with the UN suffering around 15,000 casualties and the PVA suffering around 110 to 160,000 casualties, marked the end of the PVA's attempts at large-scale offensives. By June of 1951, the front lines had stabilized once again near the 30th parallel, and both sides were exhausted from the continuous fighting. For the remainder of the war, the UN and the PVA fought but exchanged little territory as a stalemate was held. Large-scale bombing of North Korea continued, and protracted armistice negotiations began on July 10th of 1951 at Kaesong, an ancient capital of Korea located in PVA-held territory. The principal battles of the stalemate included ones such as the Battle of Bloody Ridge, a decisive UN victory, the Battle of Triangle Hill, where the PVA secured the hill itself, but both sides were unable to get a solid foothold of Sniper Ridge, and the Battle of Kumsong, which was a PVA victory. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected as the new US president, and he visited Korea to explore possibilities for ending the war after taking office in January of 1953. On March 5th of 1953, Joseph Stalin died and Khrushchev, the new Soviet premier, was reluctant to continue the Korean War. Eisenhower, along with the new Soviet premier, expressed a desire to bring the hostilities to an end. This shift in dynamics led to a new phase of armistice talks. Without Soviet support and with the stalemate in the battlefield, Mao Zedong decided that this was a good time to end the war. On July 27th of 1953, the KPA, PVA, and the UN command signed the Korean Armistice Agreement, officially ending the active fighting. However, South Korean President Syngman Rhee refused to sign the agreement, and as a result, no peace treaty was ever signed. Despite this, the war is considered to have ended at this point, with the establishment of the Korean Demilitarized Zone along the front line. This DMZ, which roughly follows the 38th parallel, has been patrolled by the KPA, ROK, and the US operating as the UN command. After the war, Operation Glory was conducted to exchange the remains of fallen soldiers. Thousands of remains were exchanged between the combatant countries. In total, over 4,000 US soldiers were identified, while North Korea recovered the remains of 220 individuals near the Sino-Korean border. And that concludes our overview of the Korean War, a conflict that lasted 3 years and had significant impact on the Korean Peninsula and the world. It was a war marked by intense fighting, shifting alliances, and ultimately a stalemate, and its long-lasting legacy shaped the geopolitical landscape of East Asia and the ongoing division of North Korea and South Korea.